Welcome. Another mystery awaits, hidden in plain sight.
The village of St. Mary Mead had seen its share of peculiar happenings, but none quite like the affair of Mr. Leonard Partridge, the reclusive sculptor found dead in his own studio under circumstances so confounding that even the local constable stood baffled. The discovery had been made in the early hours of the morning when Mrs. Ridley, his housekeeper, arrived as she did every Tuesday and Friday. Expecting the usual sight of her employer hunched over his latest work, she instead found him slumped over the massive slab of marble in the center of the room, his chisel still clutched in his lifeless fingers. The position was unnerving. His head rested against the unfinished stone as though he had fallen asleep mid-stroke. But the chisel had done more than just carve marble. It had punctured his chest in a manner that suggested a tragic accident or something more deliberate. What made the scene all the stranger was the inscription on the marble itself. Though incomplete, it read, "Here lies Leonard Partridge, who—" The rest was left unfinished, as if the sculptor had stopped mid-thought, his final act, a chilling premonition of his own demise. Constable Wilkins was at a loss. The door had been locked from the inside, and there were no signs of forced entry. The only windows in the studio were small, high up on the wall, too narrow for a man to squeeze through. The chisel wound was precise, almost too precise for a struggle, yet the idea of the sculptor deliberately stabbing himself in such a manner seemed unthinkable. A suicide note was nowhere to be found. The first suspect, naturally, was Mrs. Ridley, but her distress was too genuine, her alibi solid. The doctor estimated the time of death to be sometime around midnight, long after she had left the premises. Then there was Mr. Harold Brent, a fellow artist and occasional rival who had spoken bitterly of Partridge's recent success. But Brent had been at the village pub the previous night, seen by half a dozen patrons until closing. The villagers whispered about the sculptor's peculiar habits, how he rarely socialized and worked late into the night, his hammer and chisel ringing well past the witching hour. And then, of course, there was the matter of the inscription. Was it merely an eerie coincidence, or had Partridge known his death was imminent? Had he carved it in a moment of despair, or had someone forced him to inscribe his own epitaph before killing him? By the time word reached Miss Marple, she had already heard half a dozen versions of the event, each more outlandish than the last. She had been tending to her garden when Mrs. Harmon arrived, breathless with gossip, relaying the horror of it all. A locked room, a sculptor who foretold his own death, and a murder weapon in his own hand. It was, in Mrs. Harmon's words, a dreadful riddle that not even Sherlock Holmes himself could solve. But Miss Marple, with her delicate manner and sharp blue eyes, merely nodded and excused, herself fetching her coat and hat. It was a matter of habit, after all. St. Mary Mead might have been a quiet village, but murder, she had learned, had a way of creeping in through the most unlikely of doors. Miss Marple arrived at the sculptor's cottage with the air of a woman visiting for tea rather than stepping into the scene of an apparent murder. The yard was unkempt, strewn with marble fragments and dust, and the house itself bore the weary look of neglect. It was not a place that welcomed visitors, which suited Leonard Partridge well enough in life. Now in death, it stood as solemn and silent as a mausoleum. Constable Wilkins, stationed near the entrance, greeted her with a mix of deference and unease. Though he knew better than to underestimate Miss Marple, he was also a man who disliked having his crime scene treated as a parlor-room discussion. Yet he stepped aside, allowing her to enter. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of stone dust and oil paints. The walls were lined with unfinished sculptures, their frozen faces seeming to watch in silent judgment. Miss Marple took in everything. The disorder, the tools left scattered, the tracks of white dust on the floor, but it was the great slab of marble in the center that drew her attention first. She approached it with slow, deliberate steps. The words, "Here lies Leonard Partridge," who seemed carved with a steady hand, no sign of hesitation. A morbid joke, perhaps, or a message, intended for someone who never arrived. Her eyes drifted to the chisel still resting in Partridge's stiff fingers. A curious thing, it was not the heavy mallet he usually used for carving, nor was it a tool designed for forceful puncture. It was almost surgical, as though meant for precision rather than brute work. "Most peculiar," she murmured, more to herself than to anyone in particular. Wilkins, who had been hovering near the door, cleared his throat. "If you've come to offer theories, Miss Marple, I'd ask you to share them plainly." She smiled in that absent way of hers, as if she hadn't truly heard him. Instead, she pointed lightly at the floor. "Tell me, Constable, when you arrived, was there any sign of movement? Any footprints besides those of the housekeeper?" Wilkins frowned, looking down. Number. The dust on the floor was undisturbed except for Partridge himself and Mrs. Ridley when she ran in. No footprints leading in or out, same as the door. Locked from the inside, windows shut. It's as clear a locked room mystery as I've ever seen. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully and turned her gaze to the body. A man stabbed in the chest, but no struggle. No overturned furniture, no desperate grasping at wounds. The expression on Partridge's face was one of calm, almost acceptance. She moved slowly around the studio, trailing a gloved finger along the edge of a work table. Her eyes flitted from one item to the next, scanning the scattered tools, the draped cloths over half-finished busts, the tiny vials of pigment on a side shelf. Then she paused, bending slightly to pick up something half buried in the dust. A single white feather. Curious, she held it up to the dim light filtering through the narrow windows. "Tell me, does Mr. Partridge keep birds?" Wilkins blinked. "Birds? No, not that I know of." She studied the feather a moment longer before tucking it carefully into a handkerchief. A feather in a sculptor's studio, not from a marble carving, nor from any material Partridge would use in his work. It did not belong. Miss Marple turned next to the unfinished inscription, her keen eyes tracing the letters. There was something about them that nagged at her, an unspoken detail just beyond her grasp. She leaned in closer, examining the depth of the carving. And then she saw it. The words had been chiseled with deliberate care, but the last stroke of the final letter was slightly lighter, as if the force behind the hand had faltered just slightly. Someone had been watching him. It was an unsettling thought. If Partridge had been compelled to carve his own epitaph, was his killer standing over him, directing his movements? And if so, why? She turned to Wilkins, her voice light but firm. "I believe, dear Constable, that someone was here with Mr. Partridge last night, someone who entered without leaving a trace." Wilkins scoffed. "Impossible. The door was locked from the inside, the windows are too small, and there are no other exits." Miss Marple simply smiled, though her mind was already forming possibilities. "And yet, my dear Wilkins, someone was here. Perhaps we are merely looking for them in the wrong way." She glanced at the feather again, then at the chisel in Partridge's lifeless fingers. Somewhere in this room lay the first true clue to the deception at play. Miss Marple sat in the modest front room of Leonard Partridge's cottage, her hands folded neatly in her lap as she observed Mrs. Ridley with the careful attention of a woman who had spent a lifetime recognizing when people were holding something back. The housekeeper's hands trembled slightly as she clasped them together, her gaze darting between Miss Marple and Constable Wilkins. Though her shock appeared genuine, there was an unease about her, as though she were weighing her words before speaking. "You were the one who found him," Miss Marple said gently, her voice free of accusation. "Can you tell me exactly what you saw when you entered?" Mrs. Ridley swallowed hard. "It was terrible, miss, just terrible. He was slumped over that great slab of marble, his chisel still in his hand, and his poor face." She stopped abruptly, shuddering. "He looked peaceful, almost. But that carving, it gave me the shivers, as if he knew what was coming." "You say he looked peaceful?" Miss Marple said thoughtfully. That's rather odd, don't you think? A man who takes his own life in such a violent manner does not usually leave behind a tranquil expression. Mrs. Ridley shifted uncomfortably, her fingers twisting the fabric of her apron. I suppose I only meant he didn't look frightened. Just still. Miss Marple let the silence settle for a moment before tilting her head slightly. And before you left him the previous evening, did he say anything unusual? Did he seem worried or anxious? The housekeeper hesitated. Number. He was always quiet, always deep in his work. He hardly spoke at all unless he needed something. I left his supper on the table like always, but he barely touched it. That wasn't unusual for him, though. He could go hours, even a whole day without eating when he was in the middle of a project. Miss Marple glanced at the untouched plate still sitting in the corner. And what of visitors? Did he have any lately? Mrs. Ridley's lips pressed together, and that flicker of hesitation returned. Not many. People didn't visit Mr. Partridge often. He wasn't what you'd call sociable. Not many, you say? Miss Marple repeated softly. That suggests there were some. Mrs. Ridley exhaled sharply, her fingers tightening. Just one, that I know of. Mr. Harold Brent. He came by the day before yesterday, but they argued. I could hear raised voices through the door. Mr. Partridge told him to leave, and when he came out, Mr. Brent looked furious. Constable Wilkins perked up at that. Did you hear what they were arguing about? Mrs. Ridley shook her head. Not clearly, just angry words, but I know Mr. Brent was upset about something to do with Mr. Partridge's latest work. I believe he thought something had been stolen from him. Miss Marple exchanged a glance with the constable before rising slowly. Thank you, Mrs. Ridley. You've been very helpful. Now, I believe we should speak to Mr. Brent, don't you think, Constable? Harold Brent's cottage stood at the edge of the village, a cluttered, chaotic space that spoke of an artist's temperament. He was a thin, wiry man with a sharp gaze and an impatient air, pacing as they arrived, his fingers smudged with paint. At the sight of Miss Marple and the constable, he let out an exaggerated sigh. I suppose you've come about Partridge, he said, rubbing the back of his neck. Tragic, isn't it? But no surprise. The man was always a little strange. You saw him recently, Miss Marple noted, watching him closely. Brent's lips twitched slightly. Mrs. Ridley told you, did she? Yes, I saw him, had words with him too. And why not? The man was a thief, a fraud. Wilkins crossed his arms. You care to explain that? Brent gave a sharp laugh. He stole my idea. The piece he was working on, he claimed it was his own, but it wasn't. It was mine. I showed him sketches weeks ago, and then suddenly there he was, carving away as if he'd thought of it himself. I confronted him, but he denied it, of course. Said I was imagining things. Miss Marple's eyes flickered with interest. Did you threaten him? Brent's face darkened. I was angry, yes, but I didn't kill him, if that's what you're suggesting. I left that night and never saw him again. You were seen at the pub last night, Wilkins pointed out. But what about after? Brent let out a short breath. Went straight home. Ask anyone. Miss Marple nodded, taking in his tension, the quickness of his responses. He was lying about something, but what? They left Brent's cottage and moved to their next inquiry. Miss Diana Ford, a young woman in the village known for her elegant bearing and occasional association with Partridge. She lived alone in a charming but modest house, and when she opened the door, her expression was composed but watchful. I heard about Mr. Partridge, she said, inviting them in with a graceful motion. A terrible thing. You knew him well? Miss Marple asked. Not well, she replied with a small smile. But we spoke from time to time. He admired my profile and asked if he could sketch me once. I suppose he saw me as a muse of sorts. Did you visit him recently? She hesitated, just a fraction too long. No, not in some time. Not even last night, Her fingers twitched slightly before she folded them in her lap. "No, certainly not." Miss Marple studied her with quiet scrutiny. "Did he ever mention feeling threatened, or perhaps uneasy about something?" Diana shook her head. "Not to me. But then, he was not a man who spoke freely." As they left, Miss Marple walked slowly, deep in thought. 3 different stories, 3 different versions of events. Harold Brent's rage, Mrs. Ridley's nervousness, Diana's poised deflection, and yet none of them explained the locked door, the unfinished inscription, or the feather that had no business being in Partridge's studio. "Constable," she said suddenly, her tone bright with curiosity. "Tell me, how exactly was that door locked when you arrived?" Wilkins frowned. The key was still in the lock, turned from the inside. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Yes, I thought as much, but I wonder, my dear Wilkins, if you looked closely at the other side?" Wilkins blinked. "The other side?" Miss Marple merely smiled. "There is more than one way to lock a door, you know, and more than one way to deceive." Miss Marple walked at a measured pace beside Constable Wilkins as they made their way back toward Leonard Partridge's cottage. The evening air had begun to cool, and the village was settling into its quiet rhythm, yet her mind was anything but still. The 3 people they had questioned each had a motive. Harold Brent with his accusations of theft, Diana Ford with her vague evasions, and Mrs. Ridley with her tightly held fear, but none of them neatly explained the circumstances of Partridge's death. The locked room, the unfinished inscription, the feather. It was a puzzle with too many jagged edges. Wilkins exhaled in frustration. It doesn't add up. If Brent wanted revenge, why not steal back whatever he claimed Partridge had taken? If Mrs. Ridley had been afraid of him, why not simply leave? And Miss Ford, she's barely involved at all, yet she's lying about something. Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed, dear Wilkins. And yet I believe we must ask ourselves a very simple question." He glanced at her expectantly. Was Leonard Partridge meant to die at all? Wilkins stopped short. "What are you saying, that it wasn't murder?" "Oh, it was certainly murder," Miss Marple said mildly. "But I am beginning to suspect that Mr. Partridge himself was not the intended victim." Wilkins frowned. But then why go through the trouble of staging it? Why carve his own epitaph? And the locked room, how do you explain that? Miss Marple resumed walking, her expression thoughtful. "Because, my dear Wilkins, whoever orchestrated this was improvising. And when one improvises, one makes mistakes." She thought again of the feather, the precise yet hesitating strokes in the inscription, and the stillness in Partridge's expression. He had not fought back. He had not struggled. It was as if he had been waiting. As they entered the dim interior of the cottage, Miss Marple moved toward the work table, scanning the scattered tools once more. Her fingers brushed lightly over the half-finished sculptures, the powdered marble dust settling in soft layers on every surface. Then she stopped. "The supper," she murmured. Wilkins looked over. "What about it?" Miss Marple pointed to the untouched plate still resting on the side table. "Mrs. Ridley said he barely ate when he was working, which may be true. But it is curious, don't you think, that the meal was left completely untouched, not even a nibble?" Wilkins scratched his head. "You think he was poisoned?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "I think, dear Wilkins, that someone certainly intended him to be. And I believe that someone was meant to arrive here last night for supper." Wilkins' expression shifted as realization dawned. "You mean someone else was supposed to be here? But they never arrived." Miss Marple gave an approving nod. "Yes. Suppose, then, that Partridge himself was not meant to be the victim, but rather the host of an unsuspecting guest, and suppose further that, for some reason, he realized it." She moved toward the great marble slab once more, her gaze drawn back to the unfinished inscription. If Leonard Partridge knew that death was coming, he may have intended this as a message, but not about his own death. about the death that should have taken place instead. Wilkins let out a slow breath. Then whoever meant to poison someone panicked when Partridge caught on. They killed him another way. Miss Marple turned to him with a small, satisfied smile. And now, dear Wilkins, we must ask, who was that intended victim? The answer came swiftly. Diana Ford. She had hesitated too long when asked if she had seen Partridge the night before. She had been poised, but there was something behind her careful words, something restrained, as if she knew more than she had let on. They returned to her home without delay, and this time, when Diana opened the door, her expression was guarded. "You again," she said smoothly. "Is there something more I can help you with?" Miss Marple stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. "My dear, I'm afraid we must trouble you just a little further." Diana closed the door behind them, her posture stiff. "I've told you everything I know." Miss Marple gave her a kindly smile. "And yet, dear Miss Ford, I believe you were meant to die last night." Diana's face barely changed, but her fingers twitched, a brief, involuntary reaction. "That's ridiculous." "Is it?" Miss Marple wandered toward a small writing desk, running a gloved hand lightly over the polished wood. "You see, we found something rather interesting in Mr. Partridge's studio. A supper carefully prepared, completely untouched." She turned back, her voice gentle. "You were expected last night, weren't you?" Diana hesitated. Her composure cracked for the briefest moment before she caught herself. "I was supposed to visit, yes, but I changed my mind." Miss Marple nodded knowingly. "And how very fortunate for you that you did." Diana's breath quickened. "Are you saying that someone meant to kill you?" "Yes, my dear, that is exactly what I'm saying." Diana sank into a chair, her face pale. "But why?" Miss Marple lowered herself gracefully into the seat across from her. "That is what we must determine. Who might wish you harm?" Diana swallowed hard. "I don't know." "Perhaps then," Miss Marple mused, "the answer is not about who wished you harm, but who wished to prevent you from inheriting something." Diana's head snapped up. "Inheriting?" Miss Marple gave her a knowing look. "Mr. Partridge was not a wealthy man, but I believe he was more important to you than you let on. And I wonder, dear Miss Ford, if there was something of value at stake, something someone else wished to claim for themselves." Diana's lips parted slightly as understanding dawned. "The will?" Wilkins straightened. "What will?" Diana looked between them. I wasn't certain, but Leonard had told me a few months ago that he was making arrangements. He had no family, no close friends. I think he meant to leave everything to me." Miss Marple gave a small, satisfied nod. "Then, my dear, I believe we now have a very strong motive indeed." Wilkins stiffened. "And someone who knew about it." Miss Marple rose, smoothing her gloves. "Yes, and I think it is time we had another word with Mrs. Ridley." Miss Marple and Constable Wilkins arrived at Mrs. Ridley's cottage to find the woman sitting stiffly in a wooden chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked up at them with an expression of weary defiance, her lips pressed together as if she had already prepared herself for whatever they were about to say. Miss Marple took a seat opposite her, regarding the housekeeper with quiet patience. "You were very fond of Mr. Partridge, weren't you?" she asked gently. Mrs. Ridley's fingers twitched against the fabric of her apron. "I looked after him for years. It's a difficult thing, getting old and having no one to rely on." Miss Marple nodded. "And yet he was planning to leave everything to Miss Ford." The woman's face hardened. She hardly cared for him, barely visited, only came when she wanted something. Wilkins exchanged a glance with Miss Marple, then turned back to Mrs. Ridley. "Did you know about the will?" Mrs. Ridley's gaze flickered. "I might have heard something. It wasn't my business." Miss Marple sighed, her voice gentle but firm. "You see, Mrs. Ridley, I believe you did know, and I believe you were afraid of what it meant for you." Mrs. Ridley let out a sharp breath. That's absurd. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Not at all. You were devoted to Mr. Partridge, but his affairs were changing. You must have realized that your place in his life was not as secure as you thought. The woman's face darkened, her hands tightening into fists. I wouldn't have hurt him. Miss Marple's gaze softened. No, I don't believe you would have. But what if someone else had planned to? What if Leonard Partridge discovered that he was not the intended victim, but rather the unwilling accomplice to a crime? Mrs. Ridley's lips parted slightly, but she remained silent. Miss Marple straightened. I believe he invited Miss Ford to supper that evening, only to realize at the last moment that the meal had been tampered with. The locked room, the unfinished inscription, they were not messages about his own murder, but about the murder that should have taken place. Wilkins frowned. Then why not go to the police? Miss Marple folded her hands. Perhaps he was trying to protect someone. The room fell silent for a long moment before Mrs. Ridley whispered, He always tried to do the right thing. Miss Marple studied her. But someone made certain he never got the chance. At that moment, the front door burst open. Sergeant Blake strode in, his expression triumphant. We've got him, Miss Marple blinked. Got whom? Blake grinned. Harold Brent, the feather in Partridge's hand. It came from Brent's coat. We found it torn along the seam. And there's more. The man's got a record of theft. Seems Partridge had caught him stealing before. We found one of Partridge's missing carvings in Brent's shed. Wilkins straightened. That's quite a discovery. Blake nodded. Motive, evidence, and opportunity. We've got our man. Miss Marple's hands rested lightly in her lap. Do you indeed? Blake frowned. You don't sound convinced. Miss Marple offered a polite smile. It's all very convenient, isn't it? Blake huffed. I'd say it's thorough police work. Miss Marple's voice remained pleasant. A feather in his hand, a missing carving in Brent's shed. Too perfect, I should think. Blake crossed his arms. The man had reason to want Partridge dead. Miss Marple shook her head. No, dear Sergeant. He had reason to be angry, but not to kill. What would he gain by murdering an old sculptor? Blake sighed. Justice, in his mind. Revenge. Miss Marple's blue eyes twinkled. And yet revenge is rarely so theatrical. Blake hesitated. We have the evidence. Miss Marple rose. I do not doubt that you have evidence, Sergeant. I only wonder whether you have the right sort of evidence. Wilkins, sensing her meaning, straightened. You think it was planted? Miss Marple nodded. A feather is such a delicate thing, wouldn't you say? It drifts, it clings, it finds its way into the most unlikely places. And yet, this feather found its way into a dead man's grip as a perfectly placed accusation. Blake frowned. But the carving... Miss Marple lifted a hand. Was it truly hidden, Sergeant? Or was it meant to be found? Blake glanced at Wilkins, then back at Miss Marple. Are you saying Brent is innocent? Miss Marple shook her head. I'm saying that the real culprit is still watching. A silence fell over the room. Wilkins looked uneasy, while Blake's earlier confidence had dimmed. Mrs. Ridley's voice was quiet, but firm. Then who? Miss Marple turned back to her. That is the question, isn't it? The housekeeper's hands trembled slightly. You think they'll strike again? Miss Marple's smile was faint. If I were them, I should very much like to ensure that no more mistakes were made. Blake exhaled sharply. Right then. We keep Brent under watch, but we don't close the case. Wilkins nodded. And we start looking at who else benefits from Partridge's death. Miss Marple touched her gloved fingertips together. Yes, and we must do so before they decide to silence the truth for good. Miss Marple sat in the quiet of her cottage, a ball of soft wool in her lap, her knitting needles clicking with steady precision. The evening was cool, and the small fire in the grate cast flickering shadows along the walls. but her mind was elsewhere, threading together the loose ends of the case with far greater concentration than the wool in her hands. A crime such as this, so carefully staged yet marred by human imperfection, spoke of something more than mere impulse. The answer lay not in the present, but in something long past, something buried beneath the dust of forgotten grievances. A knock at the door broke her reverie. Constable Wilkins entered, looking slightly winded, his uniform collar askew. "News, Miss Marple?" he said, closing the door behind him. "We've been digging into Harold Brent's past. Seems he worked for Partridge for a short time years ago, but what's more interesting is that he wasn't the only one." He unfolded a slip of paper. "George Fallow. Name mean anything to you?" Miss Marple's knitting needles stilled. "Fallow. Why, yes. A tragic case. A young man accused of theft, convicted, and later found dead in his cell." Wilkins nodded grimly. Turns out Brent and Fallow were friends. Both apprenticed under Partridge. Both dismissed around the same time. Miss Marple set her knitting aside. "And you believe this is relevant now?" Wilkins hesitated. "I don't know, but the timing is curious. Fallow's conviction was based on evidence found in his lodgings. Stolen goods. People whispered it was a setup, but nothing was ever proven. He always swore he'd been framed." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "And what of Partridge? Was he involved in the accusations?" Wilkins exhaled. "That's where it gets interesting. Partridge was the one who found the missing items. Said he recognized them as his own work, but the records show the carvings were never recovered after the trial." A quiet settled between them. Miss Marple rose, crossing to a small table where a delicate porcelain vase sat undisturbed. "A sculptor's work is like a signature, Constable. It bears the mark of its maker. If Partridge claimed to recognize stolen carvings, but they were never recovered, it raises a rather important question, doesn't it?" Wilkins straightened. Whether they ever truly existed at all. Miss Marple nodded. And if they didn't, then poor George Fallow was accused on nothing more than an illusion. Wilkins rubbed his chin. So if Brent knew this, if he believed his friend was framed, he might have held a grudge. Miss Marple sighed. And yet that doesn't explain Partridge's death. Unless, of course, someone else feared that the truth was finally coming to light. Wilkins looked troubled. That would mean this murder was meant to keep something buried. Miss Marple retrieved her shawl. "I rather think it means the past has come back demanding justice, and the murderer is someone who cannot afford for that to happen." They returned to Partridge's house under the cover of dusk, its stone walls standing solemn against the fading light. Inside, the scent of wood polish and old books lingered, undisturbed except for the faint scent of oil paint still clinging to the air. Miss Marple ran a gloved hand along the edge of a workbench, pausing near a collection of chisels arranged with careful precision. "The night of his death," she murmured. "Partridge was carving something. He must have suspected danger, yet he did not flee." "Why?" Wilkins gestured to the unfinished tombstone. "Maybe he thought he could talk his way out of it." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the stone. Or perhaps he thought he had proof of something worth confronting. Wilkins frowned. "But what?" Miss Marple picked up a small wooden figurine left on the table. It was rough, unfinished, its features crude, but there was something oddly familiar about its shape. She turned it over in her hands, then looked at Wilkins. "I wonder, Constable, if you might arrange for me to see the carvings that were allegedly stolen all those years ago." Wilkins hesitated. "I told you, they were never recovered." Miss Marple smiled faintly. But you see, I believe they may have been hiding in plain sight all along." They did not have to wait long for confirmation. Sergeant Blake, though still bristling from their earlier disagreement, grudgingly agreed to pull what records existed on the stolen pieces. There were only sketches, rough outlines drawn during the trial, but they were enough. Miss Marple compared them to the small figurine in her hand, then turned to Wilkins with quiet satisfaction. This carving was not made recently. The style, the cuts, they match the old sketches precisely, and it was found here in Partridge's workshop. Wilkins looked at her, puzzled. Then Partridge was the thief? Miss Marple shook her head. No, dear boy. Partridge was the keeper of a secret. He did not find the stolen pieces all those years ago because they had never truly left his possession. Wilkins' face darkened. Then he lied. Miss Marple sighed. Or he was forced to lie. The question is, who made him do it? A sharp knock at the door interrupted them. Miss Ford stepped inside, her usual composed expression taut with strain. I heard the police have arrested Brent, she said, her voice carefully measured. Have they charged him yet? Miss Marple observed her closely. You seem very interested. Miss Ford's mouth pressed into a thin line. Only because I want this to be over. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Yes, I imagine you do. There was a flicker of something in Miss Ford's eyes, annoyance, or perhaps something deeper. If there's nothing else, I'll be leaving. Miss Marple's voice was light. Of course. Though, before you go, you might tell me something. Do you recall the trial of George Fallow? Miss Ford froze for only a moment before recovering. That was years ago. Why? Miss Marple tilted her head. Because, my dear, I believe this murder has nothing to do with inheritance, and everything to do with a crime that was never truly solved. Miss Ford's fingers twitched at her side. That's absurd. Miss Marple's gaze did not waver. Is it? There was a long silence before Miss Ford turned on her heel and walked briskly from the house. Wilkins exhaled. Well, if she wasn't nervous before, she certainly is now. Miss Marple watched the door swing shut. Yes, Constable. And that, I should say, is most telling indeed. Miss Marple sat in the modest sitting room of Partridge's house, her fingers idly smoothing the fabric of her skirt as her mind worked through the puzzle before her. The past was bleeding into the present, and now, with Miss Ford's reaction so telling, the threads were finally tightening around the truth. Partridge's death had not been about inheritance nor simple revenge. It had been about keeping a secret buried, one that had festered for years. The question remained, who had the most to lose if the truth were known? Constable Wilkins paced near the fireplace, his brow furrowed. You think Miss Ford knows something about the old case, but we don't have anything solid. She might have been close to Partridge, but there's no proof she had anything to do with what happened to George Fallow. Miss Marple's expression remained placid. But people rarely fear what they do not know. And yet Miss Ford was afraid. That suggests she understands more than she's letting on. Wilkins sighed, rubbing his temples. Even if she's hiding something, how do we get her to admit it? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Well, my dear, I've always found that when people insist on hiding the truth, it is sometimes best to let them believe they've already been caught. Guilt, you see, is a peculiar thing. It often reveals itself when least expected. Wilkins frowned. You mean trick her into thinking we have more than we do? Miss Marple's fingers rested lightly on the arm of the chair. Something like that. The next afternoon, Miss Marple arranged for Miss Ford to join them once more in the workshop, where Partridge had spent his final hours. The unfinished tombstone stood cold and impassive, the chisel marks stark against the pale stone. Miss Marple let her gaze settle on it before speaking. I found something rather interesting among Mr. Partridge's things, she said pleasantly. A very particular carving. One that, as it turns out, bears an uncanny resemblance to those missing sculptures from all those years ago. Miss Ford stiffened but said nothing. Miss Marple continued, her voice gentle. You see, the stolen pieces were never really stolen at all. They were here all along, which means that poor George Fallow did not take them. She turned slightly, watching Miss Ford's face with quiet scrutiny. Now, isn't that curious? Miss Ford's fingers curled at her sides. I don't know what you're implying. Miss Marple tilted her head. Don't you? How extraordinary, because when I mentioned George Fallow the other day, you looked, well, rather distressed, almost as if you remembered something unpleasant. Miss Ford's jaw tightened. You're grasping at shadows. Miss Marple smiled. Oh, I do apologize, my dear, but you see, the most remarkable thing happened earlier today. Constable Wilkins and I were reviewing some very old records, and we found an interesting detail. She gestured toward the tombstone. Would you believe that Partridge had recently been inquiring about revising his will? Miss Ford's reaction was subtle but undeniable. A flicker of tension around her mouth, a brief shift in her stance. Miss Marple did not miss it. Now, why would he do such a thing? Miss Marple mused. Unless, of course, he had reason to believe that an injustice needed correcting. She clasped her hands together. Perhaps he had been living with a terrible mistake, one that haunted him for years. Miss Ford took a slow breath. This is all very interesting, but I don't see how it changes anything. Miss Marple studied her a moment longer before nodding. Perhaps you're right, though I do wonder, did Mr. Partridge ever mention what he was carving on the night he died? Miss Ford hesitated. No. Miss Marple turned to Wilkins. Constable, would you be so kind as to examine the workbench again? I believe there was a notebook among the tools. Wilkins gave her a sharp look but went along with it, rummaging through the items on the table. He pulled out an old leather-bound book and flipped through the pages, though Miss Marple already knew there was no great revelation inside. She was watching Miss Ford, noting the way her fingers twitched ever so slightly as the pages turned. Wilkins cleared his throat. Nothing but sketches, Miss Marple. Miss Marple nodded. Ah, well, a shame. I'd hoped there might be something illuminating. Miss Ford's shoulders relaxed, ever so slightly. Miss Marple waited a beat before delivering the final stroke. Of course, she said, in an almost offhand manner. It hardly matters now. The authorities will have the final carving soon enough. Miss Ford's head snapped up. What? Miss Marple gave a pleasant smile. Oh yes, the unfinished piece. The one he was working on the night he died. A sculptor's work, you see, is often the purest reflection of his mind. It is said that, near the end, he returned to something deeply significant to him. A confession, perhaps? I wonder what story the stone will tell us once it is complete. Miss Ford's breathing had become shallower. Her lips parted as if to speak, but she caught herself. Miss Marple waited, giving her just enough silence to let the weight settle. Then, softly, she added, You must know what I mean, my dear. After all, you are the last person to see him alive. The crack was subtle, but it was there. A slight tremor in Miss Ford's hand, the barest flicker of her composure. Wilkins stepped forward. Miss Ford, if there's anything you need to tell us... She let out a short breath, shaking her head. I don't know anything, she murmured. But the words lacked conviction. Miss Marple simply nodded, her expression kind. Of course, dear, but you must admit it is a rather fascinating puzzle, isn't it? Miss Ford said nothing. But the battle inside her was clear. The seed of doubt had been planted, the illusion of certainty cracked. She had not expected this turn, had not prepared for it, and that, Miss Marple knew, was the beginning of the end. Miss Marple's words lingered in the air, delicate yet unshakable, like the final chisel stroke on a finished sculpture. Miss Ford did not speak, but the tiny fissure in her composure had deepened, a crack threatening to shatter under the weight of unspoken truths. Constable Wilkins, sensing the shift, held his breath, waiting for a confession that did not come. Instead, Miss Ford exhaled softly, smoothing her skirt with slow, deliberate hands. If that's all, I should be going. Wilkins hesitated, glancing at Miss Marple, who merely inclined her head. "Of course, my dear," she said, her voice warm but watchful. "Do take care." Miss Ford left with an air of forced calm, but Miss Marple noted the quickness of her steps, the way her hands clenched as if to steady herself. As the door closed behind her, Wilkins let out a breath. "You almost had her." Miss Marple gave a small smile. "Patience, my dear. Guilt is a curious thing. It festers, and when people feel the walls closing in, they often act rashly." True to her prediction, something shifted in the hours that followed. Late that evening, Constable Wilkins arrived at the station house to find a commotion. One of the officers, a young man named Turner, looked up from his desk, his face pinched with worry. "Sir, we've got a problem. The evidence room, someone's been inside." Wilkins stiffened. "What?" Turner ran a hand through his hair. "I was doing a routine check and noticed the ledger was off. Then I looked inside. That chisel, the one from Partridge's workshop, it's gone." A chill ran down Wilkins's spine. The chisel had been carefully preserved, a key piece in their case. He turned sharply toward the constable on duty. "Who's been in and out of here?" "No one suspicious," Turner said, flipping through the log. "Only authorized personnel, but I swear I locked up after my last round." Wilkins clenched his jaw. If someone had stolen the chisel, they were getting desperate. He wasted no time and went straight to Miss Marple's cottage. She was seated near the window, knitting needles clicking softly, as if she had been expecting him. "Ah, Constable, you look troubled." Wilkins pulled off his hat, shaking his head. "The chisel's gone, stolen from the evidence room." Miss Marple set down her knitting, her eyes sharp with understanding. "How very telling." Wilkins frowned. "Telling?" She smiled faintly. "Why steal it now? That chisel was not the most incriminating thing we had. It was important, yes, but by itself, not damning. And yet someone thought it was dangerous enough to risk everything to remove it." Wilkins exhaled heavily. "Whoever it was, they're getting nervous." Miss Marple nodded. "Precisely. And nervous people make mistakes." Wilkins ran a hand through his hair. "We've got no fingerprints, no forced entry. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing." Miss Marple was quiet for a moment, then murmured, "Not necessarily. Some crimes are planned, others are born of panic." She met his gaze. "Tell me, my dear, when was the last time Miss Ford was accounted for?" Wilkins stiffened. "You think she—" Miss Marple gave a gentle shrug. "She has much to lose, does she not? And fear has a way of pushing people to foolish actions." The next morning, Wilkins paid a visit to Miss Ford's house. Her face was pale when she opened the door, and Wilkins noted the faint tremor in her hands. "Constable," she said stiffly. "What brings you here?" "Just checking in," he said casually. "Routine follow-ups." Her lips pressed together. "I've told you everything I know." Wilkins studied her. "Have you?" She hesitated, her fingers twitching against the doorframe. Miss Marple's voice had echoed in his mind all night. Panic leads to mistakes. And there it was, a faint smudge on Miss Ford's sleeve, a dark streak, as if from dust or stone. Wilkins took a slow breath. "Would you mind if I had a look around?" Miss Ford tensed. "You have no right." Wilkins nodded. "You're correct, but if you've nothing to hide, then surely—" Miss Ford's expression faltered, and, for the briefest moment, something flickered in her eyes. Fear, anger, guilt. It was impossible to say. But then, with forced composure, she stepped aside. "Make it quick." Wilkins moved through the house, his trained eye sweeping over the neatly arranged space. And then, in the corner of the sitting room, he saw it, a cloth bundle, half tucked beneath a chair. He crouched, fingers brushing the fabric. Miss Ford let out a sharp breath. "That's nothing." But it wasn't nothing. The bundle was heavy, wrapped in an old linen. Wilkins peeled it back. his pulse quickening. The chisel. There were faint smudges along the handle, as if it had been hastily wiped clean, but traces of dust from the workshop still clung to the grooves. Wilkins straightened slowly, locking eyes with Miss Ford. Care to explain? Her breath hitched, her face pale as stone. Wilkins waited. Miss Ford swallowed, her composure crumbling. "I didn't kill him," she whispered. "I swear it. But he knew. He knew everything." Wilkins's grip tightened on the chisel. The pieces were falling into place, but one question remained. If Miss Ford hadn't killed Partridge, who had? And more importantly, why was someone still so desperate to keep the truth buried? A sharp rap at the door startled Constable Wilkins as he stood in Miss Ford's sitting room, the chisel still in his grip. A younger officer, breathless and flushed, burst in without waiting for permission. "Sir," he panted, eyes wide. "Another body's been found." Wilkins stiffened. "Where?" "The churchyard," the officer said grimly. "Near the old graves." Wilkins exchanged a glance with Miss Marple, who had remained silent throughout his discovery of the chisel. Now she set down her knitting with quiet deliberation. "How very ominous," she murmured. Miss Ford let out a choked sound, one hand pressing to her chest. "Who?" The officer hesitated. "It's Mr. Cooper, the solicitor." A stunned silence filled the room. Wilkins cursed under his breath. Cooper had been handling Partridge's estate, going through the sculptor's records, his accounts, his last wishes. If someone had wanted him silenced, it meant Partridge's affairs held secrets yet to be uncovered. Miss Marple rose to her feet, smoothing her skirts. "We must go at once." The graveyard was shrouded in the early morning mist, the ancient stones worn and weathered. Cooper's body lay sprawled near one of the oldest tombs, his face frozen in an expression of shock. A deep gash marked the side of his head, and a heavy stone lay nearby, darkened with blood. Wilkins crouched beside the body, jaw tight. Blunt force trauma, no sign of a struggle. Miss Marple observed the scene with calm precision, her gaze flitting from the disturbed grass to the footprints leading away from the body. "How very interesting," she murmured. Wilkins followed her gaze. "What do you see?" She pointed to the tracks. "Two sets of footprints, one leading toward the body, one away. But notice, the departing set is heavier, deeper in the soil." Wilkins frowned. "Running, or carrying something heavier than when they arrived," she suggested. The implications sent a chill through Wilkins. "But what?" Miss Marple turned her attention to the surrounding graves, studying the names and dates etched into the stones. Her expression turned thoughtful as she murmured, "This was not merely a killing, it was a message." Wilkins' patience frayed. "What are you getting at?" She pointed to the tombstone nearest Cooper's body. The inscription was weathered but still legible. "Isaac Partridge." Wilkins exhaled sharply. "His ancestor?" Miss Marple nodded. "Someone is not simply covering their tracks. They are tying the past to the present in a very deliberate way." The weight of the realization pressed down on Wilkins. "We need to question Miss Ford again." But Miss Ford was gone. The house where they had left her was empty, a chair overturned in her sitting room, her coat missing from its hook. A neighbor reported seeing her leave in a hurry, but her direction was uncertain. Wilkins swore under his breath. She wouldn't have just run. She was scared, but she wasn't. "She didn't run," Miss Marple said quietly. "She was taken." Wilkins turned to her, the words sending a cold spike of dread through him. "What?" Miss Marple's voice was steady. "Consider the timing, the stolen chisel, the second murder, and now Miss Ford's disappearance. Someone is tying up loose ends." Wilkins clenched his fists. "Then we're running out of time." Miss Marple's eyes, keen and unshaken, drifted back toward the graveyard. "Indeed, my dear, and if we do not hurry, Miss Ford may be the next to be buried." Wilkins barked out orders to the constables, sending them in all directions to search for Miss Ford. The village, usually so quiet, seemed to buzz with an undercurrent of unease. Windows twitched open as townsfolk peered out, whispers trailing in the air. A woman vanishing so soon after a second murder, it was enough to rattle even the most composed of them. Miss Marple, meanwhile, remained still, lost in thought. She glanced around the sitting room once more before turning to Wilkins. "It is not the question of where Miss Ford has gone, but why she was taken." Wilkins nodded grimly. "To silence her." "Perhaps," Miss Marple murmured. "Or perhaps because she knows something she does not yet realize." She wandered to the writing desk, where a neat row of ledgers and letters remained undisturbed, but something about them made her pause. She reached out, tapping a finger lightly against the topmost letter. Mr. Partridge's accounts. Were they not being handled by Mr. Cooper? Wilkins's brow furrowed. Yes. She picked up the envelope. Then why does Miss Ford have a letter addressed to her regarding financial matters? Wilkins' stomach dropped. What does it say? Miss Marple unfolded the letter with care, her eyes scanning the page. Then she sighed, a look of quiet satisfaction settling over her features. "Ah." Wilkins leaned in impatiently. "Well?" Miss Marple handed him the letter. "The accounts, Mr. Wilkins. They were being altered, but not by Mr. Cooper." Wilkins' pulse quickened as he read. The numbers were subtle in their manipulation, the sort of thing an untrained eye might miss. But not Miss Ford. Miss Marple pressed her hands together. She must have confronted Cooper, or at least she intended to. Wilkins swore under his breath, and whoever's behind this got to them both. Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed, but there is something more." She turned, her eyes landing on the chisel still resting on the side table where Wilkins had set it earlier. Something in her expression shifted. "That tool. It was taken, then returned, yet no one has claimed to have moved it." Wilkins followed her gaze. "What are you thinking?" Miss Marple stepped forward and picked up the chisel, turning it in her hands. "Chisels are very particular things, Mr. Wilkins. A sculptor grows accustomed to their weight, their balance. They are not easily replaced." Wilkins exhaled sharply. "And Partridge's was stolen." "Exactly," Miss Marple said softly. "But what if it wasn't stolen? What if it was swapped?" Wilkins blinked. "Swapped?" Miss Marple's fingers traced the worn wooden handle. "Sculptor's chisel tells a story. It holds the imprint of its owner, the wear of their grip. And this one..." She turned it slightly. "See the markings? They do not match the ones Partridge favored." Wilkins felt a shiver of realization run through him. "Then this wasn't his." Miss Marple nodded. "Number, but someone wanted us to think it was." She placed the chisel down carefully and turned back to the letter. "And now we have a thread, Mr. Wilkins. A pattern. Someone has been shifting the pieces of this puzzle with meticulous care, ensuring that the truth remains obscured beneath layers of deception." Wilkins's mind raced. So if Miss Ford realized something, then she is in grave danger, Miss Marple finished, and we must find her before she, too, is lost beneath the weight of this mystery. Miss Marple sat in the vicarage's study, her hands resting lightly on the delicate embroidery in her lap, though her thoughts were far from her stitches. The case had begun as a tangled web of greed and deceit, but now she saw the pattern beneath it all. The missing chisel, the altered accounts, the staged evidence, each had been a carefully placed stroke in a masterpiece of deception. Yet something had been overlooked, a truth so deeply buried that even the culprit had nearly convinced themselves it wasn't there. Wilkins paced before the hearth, frustration evident in his stance. "We have nothing. Ford is still missing. Cooper swears he had no part in this, and Partridge is dead. If there's a mastermind behind all this, they've done a damn fine job of covering their tracks." Miss Marple regarded him with quiet patience. "And yet, Mr. Wilkins, You feel it too, don't you? That something about all of this is personal. Wilkins frowned, arms crossing. It's always personal when money's involved. Ah, but this isn't just about money. Miss Marple's voice was thoughtful, her fingers idly smoothing the fabric she held. The way Partridge was killed. It wasn't hurried, nor was it reckless. It was deliberate, controlled. Someone wanted him to suffer, but not chaotically. There was precision in it, almost artistic. Wilkins exhaled through his nose. Meaning? Miss Marple met his gaze. Meaning that his death was not just about silencing him. It was a statement, and statements are made by those who feel they have been wronged. There was a heavy silence before Wilkins muttered, "Revenge." Miss Marple nodded. But not the ordinary kind. Not a simple grudge or even an act of desperation. No, this was something cultivated over time. Someone planned this for years, perhaps even decades. Wilkins looked doubtful. And you think Miss Ford figured this out? I think Miss Ford knew something without realizing its significance, Miss Marple corrected. She stumbled upon a secret, but it wasn't the missing money that sealed her fate. It was the person behind it. A knock at the door interrupted them, and a constable stepped inside, looking breathless. "We've found her, sir, Miss Ford. She was tied up in the old mill." Wilkins straightened immediately. "Alive?" The constable nodded. "Shaken, but alive." Miss Marple rose, already reaching for her coat. "Then we must speak to her at once." The old mill stood at the edge of the village, abandoned for years, its stone walls crumbling beneath creeping ivy. Inside, Miss Ford sat wrapped in a thick blanket, her face pale but determined. She looked up as they entered, eyes widening at the sight of Miss Marple. "You must stop them," she said at once. "They'll do it again." Wilkins crouched beside her. Who took you?" Miss Ford swallowed hard, her fingers trembling. "I didn't see their face, but I heard them speaking before they left me." She turned to Miss Marple. "They said something strange, about Partridge. They said he carved my name in stone before I was even born." Wilkins' brow furrowed. "What does that mean?" But Miss Marple's expression turned grave. "It means the answer has been in front of us all along." She looked toward the door, her voice suddenly firm. "Mr. Wilkins, we must return to the sculptor's studio immediately." Wilkins wasted no time. Within minutes, they were standing once more in the place where Partridge had drawn his last breath. The tools remained where they had been left, dust settling over the stone fragments from his final work. But Miss Marple's attention was elsewhere. She moved toward the row of finished sculptures, her hand reaching out to trace the names carved into their bases. And then she stopped. "Of course," she murmured. "How could we not have seen?" Wilkins stepped forward, peering at the sculpture she touched. The name inscribed there was unmistakable. Lionel Partridge. Wilkins frowned. "That's just his signature, isn't it?" Miss Marple's lips pressed into a thin line. "Look closer, Mr. Wilkins. Beneath it." Wilkins bent down, squinting. And then he saw it. Another name, nearly erased by time, but still faintly visible. Beatrice Lyle. Recognition flickered in his eyes. "Lyle, that was—" "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "The woman who died giving birth to a child Partridge never claimed. The woman whose name was carved into stone long before the child ever knew the truth." Wilkins exhaled. "And that child," Miss Marple turned to him, "grew up knowing that the man who could have saved their mother chose to abandon her instead. That child watched from the shadows as Partridge sculpted tributes to others, but never to the woman he wronged." She straightened, her expression unreadable. "And that child became an artist in their own right, one who learned not only to shape stone, but to shape fate itself." Wilkins stiffened. "You mean—" Miss Marple nodded. "I mean the person behind all of this is not an outsider. It is someone who has always been here, hiding in plain sight. Wilkins turned, already reaching for his revolver. Then we need to find them. Now. Miss Marple moved with an air of quiet certainty as she stepped out of the sculptor's studio. Wilkins followed closely, his face set in grim determination, his hand near his revolver. The village beyond was calm, unaware of the storm about to break. "We must tread carefully," Miss Marple said. "They are desperate now. A cornered animal is at its most dangerous." Wilkins nodded. "Where do you think they'll go?" Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the churchyard, where the tombstones stood in silent rows. "Back to the beginning," she murmured. The moon hung high as they approached the old cemetery. Shadows stretched long across the gravestones, and a thin mist curled around the ground. A single figure stood in front of one of the larger stones, a chisel gripped tightly in their hand. The soft sound of scraping filled the air. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "You don't have to finish it, you know." The figure stiffened. Then, slowly, they turned. The dim light revealed their face. Henry Cooper. His usually mild eyes were dark with something unreadable, his fingers trembling slightly on the handle of the chisel. "I do," he said softly. "It's the last piece." Wilkins stepped forward. "It's over, Cooper." Cooper's gaze flicked to him but returned to Miss Marple. "You understand, don't you?" His voice was almost pleading. "It was never about the money. It was never about revenge, not in the way people think." Miss Marple nodded. "It was about truth." Cooper exhaled sharply, a bitter smile crossing his lips. "Truth? That's a fine word for it. I spent my life shaping stone, but I was the one shaped. By lies, by silence, by a name that was never mine." His grip on the chisel tightened. "Partridge took everything from my mother. Her future, her dignity, and no one cared. No one remembered her, but he remembered every stroke of his chisel, every perfect form he created. He lived his life as though she never existed." Wilkins's stance remained tense. "That doesn't give you the right to kill him." Cooper let out a hollow laugh. "You think I wanted to kill him? I wanted him to know. I wanted him to carve her name with his own hands, to admit what he had done. But he refused. Even in the end, he refused." His voice broke slightly. "So I carved it for him." Miss Marple took a slow step closer. "And Miss Ford?" Cooper's jaw tensed. "She was clever. She figured it out. I never meant to hurt her. I only needed time." Wilkins was done listening. "Enough. Drop the chisel." Cooper hesitated. Then, in a single fluid motion, he turned the chisel in his hand and drove it into the stone before him. The sound of metal striking rock echoed through the graveyard, and then he stepped back, raising his hands. Miss Marple watched him with an expression of quiet sorrow. Wilkins moved in swiftly, securing his wrists as the constables emerged from the darkness. The case was closed, but the weight of it lingered in the cold night air. As Cooper was led away, Miss Marple stepped forward and looked at the freshly carved stone. Beatrice Lyle. Finally, the name was written. Finally, the truth had been chiseled in stone. As the constables led Henry Cooper away, a hush fell over the cemetery. The weight of the confession, the truth finally carved into stone, should have brought finality. Wilkins exhaled, adjusting his coat as he turned to Miss Marple. "Well, that's that," he muttered. "A sad business, but we got him." Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. Her eyes remained fixed on the tombstone, the freshly etched name of Beatrice Lyle, stark against the moonlit granite. A shiver ran through her, not from the cold, but from something unresolved, something that hovered just beyond reach. Wilkins noticed her silence and frowned. "Miss Marple." She tilted her head, her voice thoughtful. "Why carve her name here, Inspector?" He frowned. "What do you mean?" She turned toward him, her expression unreadable. Beatrice Lyle never had a proper grave. She was buried in an unmarked plot. Henry wanted her to be remembered, but why did he choose this stone here? Wilkins glanced at the grave. It belonged to Partridge. A fitting irony, I suppose. Miss Marple's lips pressed together. Fitting indeed. But something troubles me. Wilkins sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. Miss Marple, the man confessed. He had motive, opportunity. We have the murder weapon, the forged documents, everything. She nodded slowly. Yes, and yet there's one thing we don't have. Wilkins waited. A witness. He blinked. But she raised a hand. Oh, we have people who saw Henry in the workshop, people who confirm his feud with Partridge, but no one saw the moment of the crime. No one saw Henry wield that hammer. We assumed it was him because of the scene he staged. But tell me, Inspector, when has a true craftsman ever left his work so crude? A silence stretched between them. Wilkins's frown deepened. You think someone else did it? Miss Marple's eyes darkened. I think someone allowed Henry Cooper to believe he did it. A rustling noise came from the trees beyond the cemetery. Wilkins turned sharply, hand on his revolver, but Miss Marple simply stood still, listening. A moment later, the faint outline of a woman emerged. Catherine Ford. Her coat was drawn tightly around her frame, but her eyes gleamed with something unreadable in the dim light. Miss Marple, she said softly. The elderly woman studied her. Miss Ford, you shouldn't be here. Catherine stepped forward, gaze flicking to the freshly carved name on the stone. So, he confessed. Wilkins narrowed his eyes. You don't sound surprised. Catherine hesitated, then exhaled. He's been living in the shadow of that crime his entire life. In a way, he was always going to confess, whether he did it or not. Miss Marple took a slow step closer. But you knew, didn't you, that he wasn't the one? Catherine held her gaze. Does it matter? Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. The truth always matters, my dear. Catherine looked away. Her fingers clenched around the lapel of her coat. I needed Henry to believe he did it, she said finally. Because if he didn't, he would have kept digging. And if he kept digging, Miss Marple finished for her, he would have found you. Wilkins stiffened. You're saying you... Catherine's breath hitched, but she straightened. It wasn't about revenge, she said. Not like it was for him. It was about survival. Partridge found out who I really was. He knew my real name. He was going to expose me. Wilkins stared. And what exactly would that have changed? Catherine's voice was barely above a whisper. Everything. Miss Marple studied her. You weren't just Miss Lyle's friend, were you? Catherine let out a small, bitter laugh. Number I was her daughter. A stunned silence filled the air. Wilkins' hand twitched by his revolver, but he didn't draw it. Miss Marple's voice was calm. So when Partridge threatened to reveal your identity, Catherine's expression hardened. He wasn't going to reveal anything. He was going to destroy me, the way he destroyed her. Her voice cracked. She died in disgrace. I built a life for myself, a life no one could take from me, and then he found me, after all these years. I couldn't let him do it. I couldn't. Wilkins took a step forward, but Miss Marple touched his arm lightly. Catherine's gaze flicked between them, and for a brief moment there was something unspoken in the air. Then she turned and ran. Wilkins cursed, lunging after her, but Miss Marple didn't move. She simply watched as Catherine disappeared into the night, her figure vanishing between the rows of gravestones. Wilkins halted at the edge of the cemetery, hands clenched. She won't get far. Miss Marple remained still, her voice quiet. Perhaps not, but she already ran once, and no one caught her then. Wilkins exhaled sharply. Are you saying we let her go? Miss Marple finally turned to him. Her face was unreadable. I'm saying, she murmured, that sometimes the past does not rest as quietly as we'd like. The morning mist had barely lifted when the constables returned, their uniforms damp with the night's chill. Wilkins stood at the cemetery's entrance, his jaw tight, his patience worn thin. He had ordered a search, certain that Catherine Ford could not have gone far. The countryside roads were sparse, the trains infrequent, and yet hours had passed with no sign of her. One of the officers approached, his expression grim. "We found her coat near the riverbank, sir." Wilkins' eyes darkened. "And?" The officer hesitated. "Nothing else." Miss Marple stood a few feet away, her hands clasped neatly in front of her. The only sign of concern was the slight furrow between her brows. "Do you believe she drowned, Inspector?" Wilkins exhaled sharply. "It's possible. The current is strong this time of year." He rubbed a hand over his face. "But it's just as likely she planned this. Left her coat behind to make us think she's dead." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze distant. "It would be quite fitting, a ghost returning to the past, only to disappear once more." Wilkins turned to her, his voice edged with frustration. "I don't like loose ends, Miss Marple." She met his gaze. "Nor do I, Inspector. But justice is not always about the satisfaction of a closed case." He let out a tired breath. "Then what is it about?" She looked toward the gravestone, the name Beatrice Lyle carved into its surface, and spoke softly. "Understanding, and the ability to live with what we know." Wilkins frowned, but said nothing. The town of St. Mary Mead was already stirring by the time they returned. News had spread of Henry Cooper's confession, of Catherine Ford's escape, of the tangled tragedy that had unraveled before them. The villagers whispered behind closed doors, in shops and along cobbled streets. Some spoke of justice, others of fate. At the station, Henry sat in the holding cell, his hands resting in his lap. He looked older than he had the day before, the weight of years finally pressing down on him. When Miss Marple entered, he glanced up. "She got away, didn't she?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. She moved to the wooden chair across from him, settling in with a quiet grace. "She will never be free, Henry. Not truly." Henry swallowed, his throat tight. "She was my friend, you know. My only friend." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "Yes," he exhaled. "I would have confessed anyway." A small, weary smile crossed his lips. "Some part of me always believed I was guilty." She studied him for a moment. "And now?" He looked away. "Now I'm not sure what I believe." Silence stretched between them. The morning sun streamed through the barred window, casting patterns of light and shadow across the floor. Miss Marple rose. "Truth has a way of settling in, Henry, even when it's uncomfortable." Wilkins appeared in the doorway. "The judge will be lenient, given the circumstances. There's no real evidence against him for the murder itself, only for the forgery." Miss Marple nodded. "Perhaps that is justice enough." Wilkins watched her, something unreadable in his gaze. "And what about Catherine Ford?" Miss Marple turned to him. "If she's alive, she will be watching, listening, waiting for the past to catch up with her." Wilkins shook his head. "And if she isn't?" Miss Marple's expression remained unreadable. "Then the past has already done its work." Outside, the town carried on. The bells chimed from the church tower. Life, as it always did, continued. But somewhere, beyond the borders of St. Mary Mead, a woman moved unseen, a ghost in her own story, forever looking over her shoulder. And whether justice had been served or merely escaped was a question that would linger in the hearts of those who had searched for it. The evening air was crisp as Miss Marple walked along the quiet streets of St. Mary Mead. Lamps flickered behind lace curtains, their glow soft against the deepening dusk. The village had already begun to settle back into its usual rhythm, murmuring about the case one last time before the next bit of gossip took hold. It was always this way. Tragedy, intrigue, resolution, then life carrying on as though nothing had happened. Yet something about this case clung to her thoughts like a thread left loose in an otherwise tidy tapestry. Henry Cooper had confessed to the forgery, and perhaps in some way he carried a kind of guilt for Beatrice Lyle's death. But the true killer, the one who had taken her life so many years ago, had never faced justice. Catherine Ford had disappeared, perhaps forever, and with her had gone the last, elusive piece of the truth. As she reached her cottage, she paused at the gate, her fingers brushing against the cool iron latch. The night was silent save for the rustling of leaves in the breeze. She thought of Catherine's last expression before vanishing, the way she had looked back once, just once, before slipping into the unknown. It was not the look of someone who feared being caught. It was something else, a kind of satisfaction. Inside, she set a kettle on the stove and took her seat by the small writing desk, where a neat stack of correspondence awaited her. Among them was a letter, postmarked from London, its envelope of fine parchment. She recognized the careful script at once. Unfolding the letter, her eyes scanned the first lines, her pulse quickening ever so slightly. Dear Miss Marple, you once told me that truth has a way of settling in, even when it is uncomfortable. I wonder, though, whether you truly believe that. Some truths are not meant to be settled, and some mysteries, once unraveled, only lead to deeper ones. You were right, of course. Justice does not always mean satisfaction. But I ask you, as one observer of human nature to another, if you had to choose, would you rather know everything or be at peace with knowing nothing at all? There was no signature, but none was needed. Miss Marple set the letter down carefully, the faintest ghost of a smile touching her lips. Somewhere, out there, Catherine Ford was still playing the game. And though this case had come to an end, another mystery had just begun.